An 11-year-old boy is carried into a ground floor ward in Glasgow. The wheel of a cart has crossed over his left leg, and the shin bone has come through the skin. In this ward, by the surgeon's own count, close to half of all amputation cases end in death. But the surgeon does not send for the saw. He sends for a bottle of sewage disinfectant. Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is August 12th. The year is 1865. The boy is James Greenlees, and the surgeon is Joseph Lister. 38 years old, an Englishman holding the Regius Chair of Surgery at the University of Glasgow, with charge of 2 wards at the Royal Infirmary. Ward 24 is the male accident ward, and Lister has spent 4 years there watching patients endure his operations, only to die shortly afterward. That was the central fact of surgery in the 1860s. Pain had been solved. Ether arrived in 1846, chloroform the year after, and the man who introduced chloroform, James Young Simpson, was still practicing in Edinburgh. Surgeons no longer had to work in seconds against a conscious patient. They could take their time, cut deeper, and attempt more. This led to the death of more patients. The killers had names: pyemia, erysipelas, hospital gangrene, and the general blood poisoning they called septicemia. Wounds that looked clean on Monday would be discharging by the end of the week. Lister later reported that in the years before he changed anything, somewhere between 45 and 50% of the amputation cases in his ward died of sepsis. In the largest city hospitals of Europe, the picture was similar or worse. Surgery inside a hospital was more lethal than surgery in a farmhouse kitchen. Compound fracture was where that danger became a decision. A closed fracture, bone broken but skin intact, usually healed. Break the same bone so that it pierced the skin, and the odds inverted. The standard treatment for a compound fracture of the leg was amputation, on the reasoning that a smaller, controlled wound was survivable, where the ragged one was not. So the realistic choice in front of Lister that August day was to take an 11-year-old's leg and then hope for the best. Why open wounds rotted and closed ones didn't was contested. Some held it was miasma, a poison in foul air. Others argued that oxygen itself decomposed exposed tissue, the way that meat spoils. Neither theory was foolish. Both fit the observation that air was the variable. What neither theory offered was a solution for the surgeons. Lister thought he had found something a surgeon could do, and he had been rehearsing it for months. The route ran through a chemist. Around 1864, Thomas Anderson, Glasgow's professor of chemistry, pointed Lister to the recent work of Louis Pasteur on fermentation and putrefaction. Pasteur's argument was that decay was not a chemical property of air, but the work of living organisms carried in it. That distinction was everything. If oxygen caused wound rot, nothing could be done, because wounds must be exposed. But if organisms caused it, they could be killed. Lister was unusually prepared to take that literally. His father, Joseph Jackson Lister, was a wine merchant and amateur microscopist who in 1830 published a method of combining lenses that stripped color distortion out of the compound microscope, the advance that made serious cell biology possible. Lister had grown up around instruments built to resolve the invisible. When Pasteur described organisms too small to see, Lister, of all people, was unlikely to doubt they were real. Pasteur killed his organisms 3 ways: heat, filtration, and chemicals. Heat and filtration are no use on a boy's shin bone. That left the chemical. The town of Carlisle, south of the border, had been treating its sewage with carbolic acid, a coal tar derivative. The reports noted 2 effects. The stench dropped, and cattle, grazing on fields irrigated with the treated waste, stopped picking up parasites. Something in the acid was killing living things in organic filth. Anderson obtained a supply. Lister's first attempt was in March 1865, by most accounts on another compound fracture, which failed. He said so plainly in print 2 years later, blaming the outcome, as he then believed, on improper management, meaning his own technique, not the principle. On August 12th, he tried again. He cleaned the wound, set the fracture, and applied lint soaked in undiluted carbolic acid. Over the lint, he placed a sheet of thin tin to slow evaporation and keep the acid working. He then placed a splint and a bandage. The logic was not that carbolic healed anything. The logic was that the dressing was a barrier. Destroy whatever had already entered the wound, then keep the wound sealed against whatever else was in the ward. 4 days later, he lifted the dressing. There was no pus or smell. There was, however, one problem. The undiluted acid had burned the skin around the wound, so he weakened the solution for subsequent dressings, an adjustment he would go on making for the rest of his career. The dressings were renewed, the bone knit. About 6 weeks after the cart ran him down, James Greenlees walked out of the Glasgow Royal Infirmary with both legs. But one case proves nothing, and Lister did not publish. He kept treating compound fractures the same way for nearly 2 years, and only in the spring of 1867 did he lay out the results in a series of articles in The Lancet. 11 cases, 9 healed without infection, 1 amputation, and 1 death from a hemorrhage unrelated to sepsis. He described carbolic acid as the most powerful antiseptic with which surgeons were at present acquainted, a phrase that quietly conceded it might not be the best one forever. The chemical was replaceable. The claim underneath it was not. Wound infection had an external, living cause and could therefore be blocked. That claim was what the profession spent the next 20 years fighting about. The first attack came fast, and from Edinburgh. In September 1867, a letter signed Chirurgicus appeared in the Edinburgh Daily Review. The author was James Young Simpson. Simpson followed it with a signed article arguing that Lister had discovered nothing, that carbolic acid in surgery had already been described by Jules Lemaire, a Paris pharmaceutical chemist, in a book published in 1863. Simpson was substantially right on the facts and wrong on their meaning. Others had used carbolic acid on wounds. Lister had never heard of Lemaire and had to hunt down a copy. What Lister added was not the substance but the system built on a causal theory, a reason to use it, a way to use it, and a prediction about what would happen if you stopped. Simpson had his own explanation and his own remedy. He would spend the next 2 years documenting hospitalism, arguing that large, overcrowded hospitals were themselves the danger and that the answer lay in smaller buildings. The harder objections came from surgeons who tried Listerism and got worse results than Lister did. The regimen was fiddly and Lister revised it constantly, so a surgeon working from a published account was often following a version its author had already abandoned. The acid burned tissue, as Greenlees's leg showed within 4 days, and in heavier use it sickened operators as well as patients. There was also a rival approach. At St. Bartholomew's in London, George Callender pursued plain, uncompromising cleanliness without the elaborate carbolic apparatus, and by the late 1870s, his patients had an operative mortality below 4%. In 1870, Lister published his comparison. Before antisepsis, 16 deaths in 35 amputations. After, 6 deaths in 40. Roughly 45% falling to 15. Lister himself acknowledged in print that the numbers were too small for a satisfactory statistical comparison. Adoption came from outside Britain first. German surgeons took up the method in the early 1870s. Richard von Volkmann most prominently, working wards crowded with infected wounds, and the results were dramatic enough to travel. Notably, they did not all accept the underlying biology. Volkmann called germ theory the parasitic hypothesis, and observed that microorganisms still turned up in wound secretions under antiseptic treatment. Lister argued his case from ward conditions he described in 1870 as some of the most unhealthy in the kingdom. Wards where an excavation in 1867 turned up coffins from the cholera epidemic buried inches beneath the surface. He was claiming that if you controlled what entered the wound, even that ground could be operated on safely. And Lister's own conclusions kept moving with the evidence. From 1871, He used a carbolic spray to disinfect the air of the operating theater. By 1887, he had dropped it, and at the Berlin Congress in 1890, he told the assembled profession that he felt ashamed to have ever recommended it. Robert Koch's work had shown that airborne organisms were not the main route of wound infection. Hands, instruments, and dressings were. Within a decade, antisepsis was giving way to asepsis. Steam sterilized instruments, boiled dressings, gowns, and before long, gloves. An operating field made clean rather than chemically poisoned. Every sterile field in every operating room today rests on the proposition he tested on one boy's leg, that infection has a cause, and that cause can be shut out. That's same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.